Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. And you know, last week we were talking about the AH-1, the Huey, which was just an iconic helicopter from Vietnam. And now we're going to move on, because what happened with the Huey, you remember there were about 7,000 of those helicopters deployed in theater, and there were about 3,000 shot down, with quite a large loss of aircrew in the conflict. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to a machine that was built with all the lessons learned of ground attack in Vietnam. But first of all, because I'm in front of the Cobra, Greg has gone out of his way to come up with my Cobra hat. Greg, you never cease to amaze me in the hats, and so I'm going to go ahead and take off my Cobra hat. There we go. Off camera there, he gets a good catch. Very good. Now, Greg today is my anodyne assistant, not my anodized assistant, but my anodyne assistant, and he is helping me out as usual. So behind me is a very familiar sight. This is an AH-1 Cobra. Now, this aircraft is configured either as an F or a G, depending, because they went through some modifications for you aficionados at home. But the canopy and the armament setup on this is a very, very early Cobra design, because they kept being upgraded as they were in military service. So this is a very early version, and Greg can kind of pick it up on the walk around. But the first flight of this aircraft was in 1965. It was deployed in 1967, and there were 1,116. But who's quibbling, Greg? Who's quibbling? Built and in production at that time. Now Bell, with the Huey. And we have to kind of talk about the conflict. And Greg can throw up a plan view of a Huey, and he can throw up a plan view of a Cobra, so you can get an idea. But the idea with the Huey was you had basically this big flat front end, and you had the crew members sitting side by side in the front. And what was that, Greg? That was a great way to get shot as you were going into an LZ, and both aircrew, the pilot and the co-pilot that were in the helicopter in the UH-1, were really vulnerable. There was no armor, the big windshield up front, and in a configuration in the aircraft that they could really both be incapacitated by ground fire quite easily. So the Army went back to Bell and said, we really need something that we had talked about gunships, and remember, UH-1 gunships, early gunships in the conflict, were called Hogs. And the Hogs, which were the gunships, and then the Slicks, which were the troop carriers and the medevacs, they had been in to the point where the Army had realized, and the Marines and Navy had realized, that if you went in and you did things to keep that enemy, to get them to put their head down, that you could be quite successful, but you needed a lot of aerial artillery to be able to do that. And the Hogs in the configuration, because they were pretty much configured the same way as the Slicks, they were not ideal, because the enemy is doing what, Greg? They're shooting back at you, and you are foolish in conflict to think that the enemy doesn't learn from its engagement. So the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong that were trying to stop these incursions were getting quite adept in anti-aircraft fire. So they went back to Bell. Now, Bell had been working on a called the Model 207, and that was a modified, if you can believe this, Greg, that was a modified Bell 47. And Greg can throw up a picture of that. And that was called the Sioux, or the Scout, the Model 207. Now, it had, I'm going to pick up my AH-1G here, but the Model 207 had come up with what I want to call is the classic attack helicopter configuration, where now you have the crew sitting in line, So you have a gunner or co-pilot up front, the pilot in back, you have armament up front, and you have these little stubby wings that are pylons that can be used for weapons. The Bell had been experimenting with that, but the Army at that point had decided that the Scout was too lightly armored or too light for what they were trying to accomplish. So what they did is they went back and they kept working on it, and in the meantime, we were getting involved in this really major war in Vietnam. And so the feedback is coming in from the field, which is basically help. We need help. We need a specialized piece of equipment.
The new helicopter retained the dynamic system of the successful UH-1B and C models, but married these to an exceptionally slim fuselage that seated just 2 crew members in tandem, with the weapon operator below and forward of the pilot for the best possible fields of vision.
So the Army, from what they learned in the field in Vietnam, had gone back to the manufacturers and said, we need a purpose-built gunship. What we have in theater is simply not heavy enough for what is required, and we need something. So what happened there was Bell came up with the Model 209, the prototype, and there were other submissions. Now, Greg, I'm going to throw these out there. There was a Boeing AH-47, a HH-2C, a Cayman, a Piasecki 16H. Greg's going to have a lot of fun with this. A Sikorsky S-61 and the Bell 209. Now, the Bell 209 looked a lot like a production Cobra. There's one thing, and I see this a lot online. People go, oh, the Cobra, there's a picture of one with no skids. And they go, oh, the Cobra's missing its skids. The skids fell off. No, that is actually a 209 because the 209 actually had retractable landing gear at that time. That went away in the production version of the aircraft, but in the original design, the gear was retractable, which is actually kind of cool if you think about that. So Bell came up with the 209. The Army said, we love it, and they got it into production as quickly as possible. Now let's talk about the configuration of the helicopter. As you can see, when I point this at the camera, look at, think about what we talked about, if somebody's shooting at you, you've given them a very, very small cross-section to shoot at. In other words, you don't have a lot here. They put the armament up front in a turret.
It is currently equipped with a variety of armament subsystems which provide flexibility and mission effectiveness. The TAT-102A turret subsystem mounts a single 7.62 millimeter minigun and carries 8,000 rounds of ammunition in the bay aft of the turret. The XM-28 turret subsystem mounts 2 7.62 millimeter miniguns with 4,000 rounds per gun, or 2 40 millimeter grenade launchers with 300 rounds per gun, or 1 minigun and 1 grenade launcher with 4,000 rounds of 7.62 and 300 rounds of 40 millimeter respectively. In the XM-28 twin configuration, the guns may be fired individually or in pairs at 1,300 or 4,000 shots per minute.
But you had your armament up in a turret. You had these little winglets that could carry a wire-guided munition or finned unguided rockets, 2.75 rockets. And suddenly, you had something that was really potent in the field because you could maneuver that turret. The guy up front could maneuver the turret. There was also something, Greg, that this helicopter had that the Huey did not, and that was armor. You were still vulnerable with the plexiglass. An interesting fun fact, the 209, Greg, actually had ballistic glass in it. It was actually ballistic glass, but the reason they didn't go with it was because of the weight. It was too heavy, so they went with this plexiglass canopy like what you see here. But this thing would fly in directly, and it could maneuver around, and the turret could maneuver, and suddenly you had a very effective delivery system to try to attack opponents on the ground. Now, was it perfect? No. But the other thing that it had, you got to think, it had a couple of things for Bell that were significant. One was it initially shared the engine and the drivetrain with the UH-1. So from a production standpoint, although you changed the shell, the engineering, a lot of the engineering and the drivetrain in the original AH-1 was just shared technology. So it was literally off the shelf. And we've seen that happen a number of times when we want to get something going. The other thing was, although it shared the drivetrain with the UH-1, the other thing about it, it was faster. This was about 171 miles an hour on a cruise speed basis. And we talked about the UH-1 was about 120, 125. So it was a lot faster. I believe, Greg, that at one time, the AH-1 was the fastest helicopter in the world. So the Cobra, deployed in 1967, became the primary attack and support helicopter in Vietnam. Now, to tell you about how much time they operated there in the conflict, they amassed over 1 million operating hours while they were in the conflict in Vietnam. At one point, there were 1,000, almost 1,100, 1,081 of these in-country that were in combat. They went through, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on configurations because this thing went through a bunch of modifications. The Army went out and modified fire control and delivery systems, but the basic design hasn't changed very much. I'm going to talk about, they're still in service today. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but the basic configuration of the helicopter has not changed. Now, what happened to the UH-1 or the AH-1 after the conflict? I'm going to go ahead and put this down over here. They got another lease on life as they became a key attack helicopter in another conflict. But first, before we go into that other conversation and the Cobra's new lease on life, I want to talk about a salute. And the salute is to the air crews on these attack helicopters. Just when we talked about with the UH-1, this was cutting edge military stuff. Remember, we were taking something essentially from concept straight into combat. They didn't know how it was going to work. They learned as they went, but this was really tough business. And this was serious business. If the attack helicopter could not get in and provide fire support, people died. It was just that simple, especially in a hot conflict like Vietnam. And so to all of the Cobra crews throughout history, I'm going to go ahead and get into my stage 2. Now, this is an interesting one. Greg last week hit me with swamp juice, which actually wasn't as bad as the 2 weeks before, which is absolutely disgusting. This one is, and this is in honor of the swashbuckling nature of those Cobra crews, right? This is Jack Black's Blood Red Cola. Now, Greg, I don't see a sell-by date on it. I don't know where Greg gets this stuff, but this one, you have to throw the label up. This is another great label. It is from Black's Last Raid, and it says, "Drink up, you scurvy dog." So we're going to have to check that one out. This is, this one, now this could be dangerous, Greg. 4th time available in 499 years. So who knows which vintage this is, but we're going to go ahead and crack open Jack's cola here. If I can get it open. There we go. Now, to all you Cobra crews out there, God bless you. And it's not only in Vietnam. The Cobra has fought in many conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq, First Gulf War, many, many times. So all the crews that have made that what it is today, that iconic aircraft, I salute you. I think, Greg, this is flat, first of all. So this is probably the 499-year version of it. This is a vintage Thank you for getting me something vintage. Probably botulism in here or something. But nothing's too good for our salute to our crews. Greg, last week I said it wasn't my taste, but this is a pass. I'm going to let this one go. We're going to go ahead and put that down. And to Jack Black, who is not a sponsor of the program, thank you very much for that, but I think we're going to pass. So the Cobras, where did they go? We talked about they had a great combat life in Vietnam. They did a couple of things. Bell messed around with a thing called a Super Cobra, which was the 309, I believe, and that is the 309, which there were only 2 of them built. It was an upgun version of it, and it just never went anywhere. So the Army continued to use it, and primarily what happened with the Cobra after Vietnam was we were getting into something else, Greg, and we've talked about it, and that is precision munitions. We were getting more and more sophisticated, and Vietnam started it in that, in World War II, and I've talked about this before, you'd go in and you'd bomb a square or you'd bomb a section, and hopefully you got the target, and you threw a ton of weapons at it. What happened was we were starting to get into one missile, one tank, one bomb, one building. And that started in Vietnam with radio or TV-guided bombs. And the Germans went all the way back to the Fritz X with that. We talked about that before. But with we started to get munitions that could be flown into the target. They were either wire-guided, which they would fire like an anti-tank missile, and it would drop a wire out, and the operator could literally steer the missile into the target. He would have a delineator or whatever, and the missile would go to the target, getting information from the wire. And that was involved not only in anti-tank, that was in like torpedoes, Greg. There were wire-guided torpedoes. There are wire-guided munitions to this day. The other thing was something called a beam rider. And a beam rider was, as laser technology and designator technology improved, you started to get these bombs that were actually steerable from the air, that would have a laser designator on the target from the air. Again, I go back to F-117, but F-117 is a very classic example of that, which it not only has a forward-looking infrared, but a downward-looking infrared with a target designator. And the bomb that it would drop, the GBU bomb, the 2,000-pound bomb, would literally ride that beam into the target. Well, these attack helicopters became incredibly lethal with these guided munitions. Now, what were they designed to do? Well, they moved over into another colder conflict, and you know where I'm going, Greg, the Cold War. And although we were fighting the proxy wars, which were hot wars, we were also in dealing with a situation at that time where the United States and its NATO allies were very, very concerned about the Soviet Union, who had huge advantage in armor and tanks coming through the Fulda Gap and in areas in Europe to attack Europe. And that's where these attack helicopters became very lethal, because what they would do is they would have these munitions and they became tank killers. And they would literally learn how to fly nap the earth. They would get down behind trees. They would pop up. In many cases, in later attack helicopters, they would have a camera or sensors on the top of the mast. They could look up, fire, and come back down and present a very little target. So Cobras at that time became tank killers to try to blunt what could have been, and thank goodness never happened, a Soviet assault into Europe, into Western Europe. And that never happened, but that's how that evolved. Now, the Cobra continues to go on to this day. It operates with the Marines. It's the AH-1Z. You can imagine how many versions we've gone through. We're at the Z version, which is also called the Venom. It is the epitome of the evolution. And it has a big, heavy chain gun up front, big, heavy, again, in the turret. It can fire wire-guided munitions, rockets. It is incredibly lethal. These aircraft fought in the Gulf War, after the Cold War. They fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and they are still deployed. So this is one unusual airplane in our collection, Greg, that is actually still in active service in one model. They are very, very dangerous. The Marines continue to operate them. So they have a life span that is going to continue to go on for some time. They are operated by other countries, and so this type is going to be around for a long time. Now, what is the Cobra's legacy? And then we'll talk about this aircraft behind me. Cobra's legacy is probably the Apache is the legacy. What ended up happening with attack helicopters is this version in the 60s became so good, and our adversaries started learning. The Soviets came up with the Mi-24, the Hind. Now, the Russians went with a completely different doctrine. The Russian aircraft, helicopters, are kind of like flying tanks. I mean, they're big, heavy. They have adopted a more nimble design of attack helicopters since then, but in the Cold War, when they were offsetting Cobras, Russian doctrine was similar configuration, the inline configuration, winglets, but very, very heavy armored platforms. The Bell decided not to do that. This could take a punch, but the Russian helicopters were really tough. Russian helicopters flew heavily in Afghanistan when they were fighting in Afghanistan, and there are many accounts of them taking all kinds of heavy machine gun ground fire, nasty stuff, and continuing to fly. But the Cobra, really, that's what it created. So our adversaries learned from the Cobra. In our case, we went to the Apache, which is the epitome of sensors, turrets. It has a version called the Longbow, which has sensors in the mast. It can pop up so it can fly nap of the earth. It deploys all the latest technology. But the concept that the Cobra came up with initially is still what the Apache is. So the Cobra had a big impact on this type of design, and this type of aircraft is here to stay. Now, this aircraft behind me is a composite airplane. This is a F or a G model. As I said, it's very, very early. It hasn't been modified with a square canopy. Greg can get a close-up. It has the armored tub with the pilots sit in. We've restored it. The interesting thing, and Greg can get a close-up shot of this aircraft is signed by a number of aircrew that flew it with their units. So when you come to the museum, you got to check that out. That is extremely cool. This also has the very early armament where it has the minigun up front, the rotary minigun up front, and a 40-millimeter grenade launcher. It also carries the very early rocket pods. So this is configured something that would have just gone into Vietnam in 1967. But it is a great display here, and you should absolutely check it out. Now, if you are a helicopter aficionado, and I know that Greg is because he actually flies this around the office. Greg is giving me a little bit of merchandise today. This is the AH-64 Apache. This is the version that we talked about that is the follow-on aircraft from the Cobra. You can actually go out to the website and pick this up. It has you can make little helicopter noises, has a little landing pad, and you can go ahead and get that, but go out to the site. Now, the other thing is, if you're an air pirate, you go out and you pick up, this is one of my favorite shirts in the collection. This shirt goes all the way back. This is a Stan Stokes design, and it goes all the way back about 10 years ago when we were talking about when we were flying, and we said, oh, we're kind of like air pirates. That's a little Fred fun fact, and that's what created this logo. Stan Stokes came up with this, and it's been in the collection ever since. Go out and get one of these. This is a very cool shirt, Gothic design. People will ask you where you got it, and they may actually want to sign it because they're so excited that you're wearing that shirt. So it is, go out to it's made of the finest quality. You want to get out and get that shirt. Greg is laughing at me right now. So I'm going to wrap this one up. Remember that, again, this is another restoration. I mean, this is a complete restoration on this. The one thing about this also that's kind of cool before I jump out, Greg, shark's teeth. I've talked about this before, but somebody will jump in the comments section because somebody will argue with me about this. But the earliest known version of shark teeth was when, Greg? The ME-110 on German aircraft in early part of World War II. That's one of the earliest known use of shark teeth, but this has shark teeth on it. But this aircraft is completely restored, and we can't do it without your donation. So go out to the site, hit that donation button, and help us keep doing it. We hope you've enjoyed Warbird Wednesday. Remember, subscribe to the channel. Send it to that aviation aficionado that you know. Like us on YouTube. Like us on Facebook. We'll see you again next week. Thanks very much for visiting us. Have a great day.